the Atlantic Monthly. Anybody here familiar with this magazine? It's kind of a general purpose magazine, right? It's not political, it's not science. They dive into all sorts of different topics. But the reason I bring this up is because they actually did something really interesting a few years ago. About in 2013, they asked some celebrities what was the greatest speech, historical or fictional, ever given. And so they chose people to give them an answer as to what the greatest speech ever given. And there's a little hint here as to where they went, from the New Testament to Animal House. I'm going to talk about both. Okay. So I'll give you some of the other answers. So George Bush's speechwriter, Matthew Scully, said John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. That's not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you. Gabby Giffords, U.S. Congresswoman, also chose JFK, but the speech that he gave at Rice University about why we need to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard, kind of motivated a whole generation to study science and challenge us. Herm Edwards was a former NFL head coach, and I was a commentator on one of the networks, said Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. Sure, I think a lot of us would consider that one of the greatest speeches ever given. Melinda Gates, wife of Bill Gates, said Martin Luther King's Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. I have to admit, I don't know that one, but another MLK speech. Jim Harbaugh, former NFL quarterback and current head coach, said Winston Churchill, during World War II, when he said, we will fight on the beaches, and he ends, we will never surrender. This is to the invasion of the Germans in Europe. Ted Whitmer, Clinton's speechwriter, said Lincoln's second inaugural address. Ben Stein, Nixon and Ford's speechwriter, said Shakespeare, To Be or Not to Be speech is one of the greatest ever written. Again, Jim Harbaugh picks Shakespeare's Henry V speech about Band of Brothers. Okay? What do you guys think? Good selection? They tend to be Western focused. They tend to be more modern. Shakespeare is the oldest one on this list, but they tend to be Western and modern. Remember I said it was from the New Testament? You guess which one we're talking about in the New Testament? Animal House. Who's ever seen Animal House? If you have not seen Animal House, one of the great movies of all time. It's out on left field comedy, all right? So actually, somebody picked this line from Animal House as the greatest speech ever given. The great John Belushi said this line in Animal House when their fraternity was being shut down. And he was fighting, no, we're not going to. So his character was Bluto, and the movie is Animal House. The reason I haven't told you who picked this as the greatest speech ever yet. The reason this person picked this as the greatest speech ever is because great speeches can inspire nations, armies, and teams to win against the odds or take action when things seem hopeless. In that tradition, an entire generation can recite the simple message delivered by careless fraternity brothers. So how was it careless? The Germans did not invade Pearl Harbor, right? But he motivated his entire fraternity to fight against the establishment. And this person picked this as the greatest speech because it's a simple message that we can all rally around. This person was serious, that this is one of the greatest speeches ever, because this person is General Stanley McChrystal, who led the U.S. troops in Afghanistan. This was not a joke. He actually picked this as his nominee for the greatest speech. I thought that'd be. These are some other candidates. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Newt Rockne, win one for the Gipper. Newt Rockne was a football player, or coach. Elizabeth I, which I think actually is a great line. I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. This is against all the people who are trying to dethrone her. The only speech listed more than once in the Atlantic Monthly's list of the greatest speeches ever written was the Sermon on the Mount. And it was listed by I think it was 5 different people listed this as the greatest speech ever written. And their reasoning is, it defines humility. This is according to a speechwriter for John McCain. Pat Buchanan said it teaches us how men ought to live. John Lewis, a representative from U.S. Congress, said the world would finally be at peace within itself if you follow the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. White House, an author of the White House speeches said, for its sheer reach and influence, it's the central teaching of one of the world's greatest religions. That's why it was chosen as the greatest speech by 5 different people, the only speech such as that. Okay, so it's the Atlantic Monthly, right? But I thought it was interesting. So let me give you a little bit of background on the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to dig into some thoughts on it. It was given during Jesus' first year of his public ministries. It was on a small little mount on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee in Capernaum. And really it is, if you read, it's 3 chapters, right? Chapter 5, 6, and 7. If you read those 3 chapters, it does distill the message of the gospel. from those 3 chapters, if I was somebody who has no knowledge of Christianity and no knowledge of Jesus, and I just want to give them a taste of what Christianity and Jesus' message is, some people say start with the Gospel of Mark because it's the shortest and fastest moving. That's true. But if all I want is just to give somebody 3 chapters to read, they're not all that long, reading the Sermon on the Mount will give the person a really good essence of what the message is of the gospel. It's very well summarized. So here's kind of a breakdown. I'm not gonna, again, I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail, but it starts with the Beatitudes. A lot of these are some of the most famous passages by Jesus in the Bible. It talks about us being the salt and the light of the earth. It talks about the fulfillment that Jesus came to fulfill the law. It talks about anger and leading to murder. It talks about lust leading to adultery. It talks about divorce, remarriage, oaths and vows. It talks about changing eye for an eye, loving your enemies, giving to the needy, how to pray. You guys know what passage talks about how to pray in the Sermon on the Mount? It talks about how to fast, laying your treasures in heaven, not worrying, not judging, asking, seeking, knocking, the golden rule, love others as you love yourselves, do unto others as you do unto yourself. The narrow gate talks about false prophets, the tree and its fruit, and then the wise builder, building on a sound foundation. These are the kind of headings of all the passages in the Sermon on the Mount. Pretty rich stuff. Not light, rich and deep. Okay? So it does how to pray, the Lord's Prayer, maybe the most recited passage in the Bible, maybe in human speech, the Lord's Prayer, right? Recited by Christians worldwide several times a day, right? Being poor, blessed are the poor in spirit, the meek, the merciful, the peacemakers. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus turns the world upside down, literally, right? He says, the way we did things in the past, no, we're changing them, right? We're not doing eye for an eye anymore. We're doing turn the other cheek. Not just love your neighbor and hate your enemy. No, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, right? And he talks about the golden rule, which I just talked about. Do unto others whatever you would have them do to you. The golden rule. Again, each one of those by itself would be like a significant, amazing teaching to learn, but they're all together in this great single speech. So these 3 verses literally have the influence on how Christians live and how Christians influence society around them, if we follow them. How to overcome hate, how to be pure, how to remain faithful to your word, how to forgive, how to love your enemies, how to strive for perfection, what is true righteousness versus self-righteousness, right? He always talks about the Pharisees being self-righteous and not to act like them, but to be truly righteous. How to show mercy, how to pray, how to fast, not to hoard your wealth, but to hope in God instead, to let you where your treasures are, and not to judge. It's not really a speech, it's more than a speech, and that's very, very true. This is, calling it a speech kind of puts it on the same level as everything else, but the reason so many people called it the greatest speech ever, because it's more than a speech. It's much more than a speech, right? Why? Because of who speaks it, who's Jesus, Son of God. God himself gave us lessons how to live, right? Who was it spoken to? Simple answer, group of people listening to Jesus on the Mount. But who was it really spoken to? Everyone. All mankind, not just at that moment in time, but through all history and in the future as well. It was given to all of us. It's relevant to us today. It's relevant to everyone in the world. And I'm going to prove that to you in my quotes I'm going to show you later on. Of what it does. And I talked a little bit about that in the previous 2 slides, right? Martin Luther King's speech inspired who, primarily? African Americans living in the U.S. to fight against oppression, right? John F. Kennedy's speech motivated who? Americans to do better in their country. But Jesus' speech went beyond that. It went beyond a group of people, a race, or citizens of a certain country. It went beyond that. You could argue again, early Christians thought, what did Jesus come to do? To free them from the Romans? He quickly shot that down and showed them, no, it's beyond that. Much bigger than a certain group of people under oppression from a certain government. No, this is beyond that. This was for all people at all time, all races, genders, anything, ethnicities, okay? Maybe this 3rd bullet is the most important. Jesus' speech tells us how to get to heaven. And it tells us how to do that by entering through the narrow gate. How to be perfect just as our Heavenly Father is perfect. How to ask, how to seek, right? How to knock for it to be open for us. It's a great speech. It's a timeless speech. As we read in Mark chapter 13, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Jesus said that about his words. And that's very, very true in the Sermon on the Mount. It doesn't change or deteriorate with time. It applies equally back then, today. It applies equally to men and women. It applies equally to any race. And I'm going to say it actually applies equally to any religion. And I'm going to prove that to you. Okay? It's that strong of a speech. So I'm actually giving you how important this is. I'm going to start with the rest of my talk. The rest of our discussion is going to be different comments on the Sermon on the Mount to prove to you how important and how historically significant this speech is. Okay? I'm going to start internally. So after Jesus finished the Sermon on the Mount, St. Matthew tells us, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he taught with real authority, quite unlike any of their teachers of the religious law. So right then and there, the impact was felt of the sermon. People were like, can you imagine them? Jaws dropped, just kind of in stunned silence, saying, wow, this is different than anything else we've ever heard. So right there, the impact was felt immediately. And the impact, like I mentioned before, is lasting. It still has that same impact on people when they read it. So that's an internal validation of the Sermon on the Mount from St. Matthew himself. We're going to start asking you guys to read certain quotes by different people on the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to start with, I've divided this into, I think, 4 parts. I'm going to start with the religious leaders. St. Augustine, the great St. Augustine, on his commentary on the Gospel of St. Matthew.
If anyone will piously and soberly consider the sermon which our Lord Jesus Christ spoke on the Mount, as we read it in the Gospel according to Matthew, I think that he will find in it, so far as regards the highest morals, a perfect standard of the Christian life. And this we do not rashly venture to promise, but gather it from the very words of the Lord himself.
Some people say that the inside of the Sermon of the Mount are the status and regulation of the Christianity, and we add that they are the highest instruction ever known to man. Pope Shenouda.
All right, so both St. Augustine and Pope Shenouda kind of talk about it as, St. Augustine talks about it as morals and the standard of Christian life, sort of rules and regulations, but Pope Shenouda says it's even further than that. He agrees with that, but it's even further than that. It's the highest instructions ever known. So it raises us to a higher level than previously thought man can achieve. So those are 2 kind of Orthodox theologians, right? I'm going to talk about some Western theologians who may think differently about Orthodoxy.
Humanly speaking, it is possible to understand the Sermon on the Mount in 1,000 different ways, but Jesus knows only one possibility: simple surrender and obedience. Not interpreting or applying it, but doing and obeying it. That is the only way to hear his words. He does not mean for us to discuss it as an ideal. He really means for us to get on with it.
The Sermon on the Mount is a statement of the life we will live when the Holy Spirit is having his way with us.
Theologians who have commented on the Sermon on the Mount, as you would expect theologians to do, right? We have Orthodox theologians in St. Augustine and Pope Shenouda, and you have Western, more Protestant-focused theologians on the Sermon on the Mount. Nothing too surprising, nothing too unexpected. I want to talk about some non-theologians who commented on the Sermon on the Mount.
Most people are willing to take the Sermon on the Mount as a flag, sail under, but few will use it as a rudder by which to steer.
We live in a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants, in a world that has achieved brilliance without wisdom, power without conscience. We have solved the mystery of the atom and forgotten the lessons of the Sermon on the Mount. We know more about war than we know about peace, more about dying than we know about living.
I doubt if there is any problem in the world today, social, political, or economic, that would not find a happy solution if approached in the spirit of the Sermon of the Mount.
But if Christ hadn't delivered the Sermon on the Mount with its message of mercy and pity, I wouldn't want to be a human being. Kurt Vonnegut.
The Sermon on the Mount went straight to my heart.
The teaching of the sermon was meant for each and every one of us.
When asked what he considers to be the solution of the problem of this country and Great Britain, he said, "When your country and mine shall get together on the teachings laid down by Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, we shall have solved the problems not only for our countries, but for those of the whole world."
But when I came to the New Testament and the Sermon on the Mount, I began to understand the Christian teaching, and the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount echoed something I had learned in childhood, and something which seemed to be a part of my being, and which I felt was being acted up in the daily life around me.
All right, so all those quotes on this page, 4 of them by Gandhi. Does that surprise people? That somebody who is not even Christian, I don't know, didn't dabble that much in Christianity, but has read the Bible thoroughly, obviously, is that taken by the Sermon on the Mount. That third one is really, really important, because that third one was during the time where India was fighting for independence by the colonial, right? And he was, I love reading biographies. And I've read probably 2 or 3 different Gandhi biographies. And a lot of it talks about his struggle for Indian independence under the British colonial rule, and his whole, obviously what he's famous for, right? Peace, non-violent protest. And so he was asked here by actually one of the British leaders, how are we ever going to solve this problem? We're both kind of at an impasse. The British don't want to let go of India, and India will not stand to be under the oppression of or under the rule of the British. And his answer is very simple. He says, if you follow the Sermon on the Mount, not only are our problems resolved, the world's problems will be resolved. I have to think that his whole non-violence message was influenced by the Sermon on the Mount. I have to believe that he felt that strongly about it. So that was a really powerful quote, and those are powerful considering who it came from. So let's maybe redouble our effort to follow the Sermon on the Mount. It is the most powerful teaching in probably the entire Bible, and so let's not take it lightly. Maybe we hear some of these things too much. The Lord's Prayer, we hear it so often. We hear about the Beatitudes so much. But let's really take them to heart and read them as if we're reading them for the first time and see what impact it has on our hearts.